Chapter 2. By mid November 1963, officials in Washington were putting the finishing touches on the final draft of the plan for a coup in Cuba. While the plans were being approved by JFK's top military leaders like Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Maxwell Taylor and Defense Intelligence Agency Chief General Joseph Carroll, much of the actual work was being done by Army Secretary Cyrus Vance. Helping Vance with some of the planning was his assistant, Joseph Califano, and Califano's aide, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Haig. According to Harry Williams, Vance was fully aware of Almeida's role. Califano and Haig have gone to great lengths in their autobiographies and public comments to stress that Vance was privy to more information about the Cuban operations than they were, and have never acknowledged knowing about Almeida. However, Haig and Califano acknowledged freely that they worked extensively on covert Cuban operations in the summer and fall of 1963, and their names show up in several plan for a coup in Cuba documents. Their public comments help to describe the situation at the time. On ABC's Nightline, Haig said that Bobby Kennedy was running the secret Cuban operations hour by hour. I was a part of it as deputy to Joe Califano and military assistant to Cy Vance, the Secretary of the Army, who was presiding over the State Department, the CIA, and the National Security Council when it came to Cuba. I was intimately involved. Califano's autobiography wasn't published until 2004, and in it he says presidential demands for a covert program to eliminate the Soviet military presence in Cuba intensified. Helping develop this covert program and direct the Defense Department's role in it occupied much of my time in 1963. Califano goes on to say, I felt I was working directly for the Attorney General and through him for the President, and with one exception, I enthusiastically joined the administration's efforts to topple Castro. Califano says that exception was a suggestion to assassinate Fidel, but he notes that at that meeting, the CIA representatives sat silent. Califano later bemoans the fact that the Warren Commission was not informed of any of the efforts of the CIA and Robert Kennedy to eliminate Castro and stage a coup. In the fall of 1963, November 1963, and those didn't even include the U.S. military's detailed invasions plan for Cuba. All of the quotes in the following brief summary are from the coup plans that Cyrus Vance sent to General Maxwell Taylor. CIA and state had also contributed to and signed off on the plans, which calls for the leaders of the coup to have some power base in the Cuban army and to be in contact with the United States prior to the coup. The U.S. would also seek the cooperation of selected Cuban exile leaders. The whole point of the coup would be to stage a seemingly internal palace coup in Cuba that would neutralize the top echelon of Cuban leadership. The term neutralize is simply a nice way of saying kill. The plan stressed that from a political viewpoint, it is important the revolt appeared genuine and not open to the charge of being a facade for a forcible U.S. overthrow of Castro, since a well planned and successful rescue of a revolt could be made politically acceptable to U.S. allies and the Soviets. The coup plans say that after Castro's death, President Kennedy would warn the Soviets not to intervene, an important consideration since 12 to 13,000 Soviet military personnel of all kinds remain in Cuba. The leaders of the coup would have announced via radio and other means the establishment of a provisional government. They would have appealed to the U.S. for recognition and support, particularly for air cover and a naval blockade, ostensibly to make certain that the Soviets do not intervene, but actually by prearrangement to immobilize the Cuban Air Force and Navy. After completion of such initial air attacks as may be necessary, provision will be made for the rapid incremental introduction of balanced forces, to include full scale invasion if necessary. The plans also say that U.S. military forces employed against Cuba should be accompanied by U.S. military trained free Cubans. Several hundreds Such Cuban exiles had been trained at Fort Benning, Georgia, and Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and were ready to be deployed by mid November 1963. If the coup went well, it was hoped that Cuban exile U.S. troops might be the only U.S. forces required. The United States wanted support from its allies, and the Kennedys' ultimate goal was a free and democratic Cuba. The plans say the OAS, Organization of American States, will send representatives to the island to assist the provisional government in preparing for and conduct of free elections. Among the Joint Chiefs, evidence indicates that only Maxwell Taylor and DIA Chief Joseph Carroll were fully informed about Almeida. Others, like Air Force Chief General Curtis LeMay, were too hawkish and close to JFK's conservative adversaries in Congress to be trusted, to know everything, especially about a plan that might be canceled if there was a breakthrough with the secret peace feelers to Castro. As JFK biographer Richard Reeves discovered, JFK was worried about the possibility of a military coup by a U.S. general if he was perceived to have suffered another disaster like the Bay of Pigs. Though military leaders like General Carroll had a greater role in the coup than the CIA, some of the CIA's activities caused him problems. A CIA memo describes General Carroll's frustration with the CIA regarding the coup, a dissatisfaction that the general expressed to a Cuban exile in a meeting held in a car in November 1963. Meeting about the upcoming coup in a car instead of at the Pentagon was apparently for security reasons, but that didn't prevent General Carroll's complaints about the CIA from being reported to that very agency. Such domestic spying was all too common in those days, and General Carroll was part of that apparatus. His DIA was a newly created umbrella organization that was supposed to coordinate the activities of services like Army intelligence and naval intelligence, which later congressional investigations found had been involved in domestic surveillance for many years. While the CIA had been tasked with getting more U.S. assets into Cuba prior to the coup, some of those assets were current or former U.S. military personnel who were also involved with the CIA. At least one of them under tight surveillance in November 1963, as he had been since his return from the Soviet Union in 1962. As we first revealed in 2005, naval intelligence was maintaining phone, mail, and visual surveillance on Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife. Since naval intelligence lacked the resources to maintain such surveillance in many areas, they relied on assistance from the FBI and the CIA. Our source, who maintained reports about Oswald and other domestic surveillance targets, says that Oswald's folder contained a CIA phone number to call if he were ever involved in any problem. Today, the vast majority of Americans have no idea that in the days and weeks before JFK's trip to Dallas, Bobby Kennedy had a secret subcommittee developing plans for what to do if a U.S. official were assassinated. The development of contingency plans for dealing with the possible assassination of American officials grew out of planning for the coup and involved many of the same officials. This planning had begun in September 1963 to deal with possible retaliation by Castro if he learned that JFK and Bobby were plotting to overthrow him. However, since some of the officials working on these contingency plans didn't know about Almeida, they no doubt viewed the issue far differently and with far less urgency than the few who did. Only three of the many only three of the many files this subcommittee generated have been declassified, though we also spoke with two members of the Kennedy administration who were familiar with the plans. One of the sources was an official who worked on the plans but had not been told about Commander Almeida. The source was a Kennedy aide who saw the plans after they were drafted, but also knew about Almeida and the imminent coup. While declassified plans showed that the subcommittee believed the assassination of American officials to be likely in the fall of 1963, they considered assassination attempts unlikely in the U.S. If Fidel found out about U.S. plans and decided to retaliate, they felt he would risk assassinating an American official only outside the United States, for example, in a Latin American country. Bobby and the officials working on the plans, especially those who knew about Almeida, were considering how the United States should react if, for example, the U.S. ambassador to Panama was assassinated and his murder appeared to be linked somehow to Cuba and the upcoming coup. One of Vance's memos about the coup stresses the importance of having certain types of information to enable the president to make visible decisions so they could avoid any situation where the president would lack essential evaluated information, but would at the same time be under heavy pressure to respond quickly. Bobby and the other officials didn't want JFK to be under pressure from the public, the press, or Congress to take hasty action against Cuba if early reports pointed toward Cuban involvement in the deaths of a U.S. official in Latin America. A hasty U.S. military attack against Cuba could provoke devastating retaliation from Cuba. Also, imagine the disaster if the United States started bombing Havana, only to have evidence emerging proving the U.S. official had been killed not by Fidel but in a routine robbery. To avoid those problems, the Kennedy aide cautiously indicated some of the conditions necessary for JFK to make an informed, reasoned response to the apparent assassination of a U.S. official in Latin America. First, the U.S. would need to control and limit initial publicity to keep the news media from generating an outcry for an immediate military response against Cuba. To protect Almeida, any possible links between the assassination and the coup plan would have to be hidden from the press. U.S. investigating agencies would need to take control of the investigation from local authorities as soon as possible, including gaining possession of important evidence. The autopsy would have to be conducted at a secure U.S. military facility to ensure that information couldn't be leaked to the press. All of this would give JFK the time and information needed to make an appropriate response. In the third week of November 1963, the Cuba contingency planning was still going on, even though most of those working on it hadn't been told crucial information. That officials had uncovered plots to assassinate JFK during his planned motorcade in Chicago on November 2nd and in Tampa on November 18th. In hindsight, it's hard to believe that most of those working on the plans to deal with the assassination of a U.S. official weren't told of the Chicago and Tampa attempts to assassinate JFK, especially since each appeared to have possible links to Cuba. However, as Chapter 5 documents, both attempts were kept out of the press because of all the secrecy surrounding the upcoming coup. Apparently, JFK and Bobby decided that sharing information about the attempts with the entire subcommittee and potentially their supervisors, aides, and secretaries could compromise the security of the entire coup plan. In contrast to all the secret planning that JFK and Bobby hoped would never be revealed, the Kennedy brothers were also concerned with building positive publicity about the aftermath of the coup. If everything went according to plan, it would appear as if JFK had responded well to an unexpected crisis, removing Cuba as a liability in his 1964 presidential campaign. Part of their publicity plan included a Kennedy backed book and television project about the Bay of Pigs, though the JFK Almeida coup plan was unknown to the journalists involved. While it may seem odd for JFK and Bobby to have wanted to remind voters of their biggest disaster, it makes sense given the individuals involved in the projects. Bobby was friends with Washington reporter Haynes Johnson, who was working on a book with the help of four Bay of Pigs veterans trusted by the Kennedys, including Harry Williams and Manuel Artime. Chet Huntley, another Kennedy friend and one of the top news anchors of the day, was handling the TV project. Along with David Brinkley, Huntley anchored America's most popular news broadcast each weekday evening on NBC. Bobby knew that Huntley's Bay of Pigs special was slated to run after the coup, allowing the program to end with the triumphant return to Havana of Bay of Pigs heroes like Harry and Artime. Harry Williams usually shied away from publicity, but at Bobby's request, he was involved with both the book and TV projects. The personable Harry became close friends with journalist Haynes Johnson and friendly with Chet Huntley. Both men admired Harry for his bravery, as did JFK and Bobby. Harry had distinguished himself not only in fighting at the Bay of Pigs, but also even as he lay gravely injured in a field hospital after his capture. In a well documented encounter, when Fidel showed up unexpectedly to visit the wounded captives, Harry weakly pulled a pistol out of his boot, pointed it at Fidel, and squeezed the trigger. But Harry's pistol only clicked. His fellow prisoners had removed the bullets because they were worried Harry might use them on himself due to his capture and grievous injuries. Coupled with Harry's agreement with Castro to return to his Cuban prison if he were unable to get JFK and Bobby to make a deal to free the remaining prisoners, his actions cemented his heroic stature in the eyes of Cuban exiles, Bobby and JFK. Journalists from Haynes Johnson to Newsweek editor Evan Thompson have written about the close personal relationship that developed between Harry and Bobby by 1963, which is why Bobby and JFK put Harry in charge of Exile's side of the JFK Alameda coup plan. It was up to Harry to recommend a handful of selected Cuban exile leaders who would become part of the coup plan, subject to approval from Bobby and JFK. Most of Harry's recommendations were accepted, and five groups were selected. The hundreds of other Cuban exile groups, many of whom had received lavish support from the CIA for years, had their financial aid cut back severely or cut off completely, creating much resentment. The exile leaders and groups Harry, Bobby, and JFK chose were Manuel Artime, the extremely conservative former Bay of Pigs leader and best friend of CIA agent E. Howard Hunt, Tony Varona, a former Cuban senator who had recently headed the largest U.S. backed Cuban exile group, the CRC Cuban Revolutionary Council, Manolo Rey, head of JUR, Junta Revolucionaria Cubana, considered one of the most liberal exile groups and hence distrusted and disliked by Artime and Hunt. Eloy Minoyo of the SNFE, Second National Front of Escambray, also seen as very liberal. Harry called him a man of action because, unlike many office bound exile leaders, he had been willing to personally lead raids into Cuba the previous year. The Cuban American U.S. Army troops in officer training at Fort Benning, Georgia, considered the cream of the Bay of Pigs veterans from a military standpoint. This multiracial group of Cuban exiles would be the first U.S. troops into Cuba after the coup. Many of these men had worked with Fidel and Almeida during the revolution and its imminent aftermath. One by one, they left Cuba or were forced to flee. Now, Harry was trying to meld them into an effective group that could help to rule Cuba after the coup, during the transition to democracy and eventual free elections. But this goal proved difficult because their political differences were so great. Recently declassified memos show the scope of Harry's problem. As of June 26, 1963, an FBI informant reported that Minoyo would not be welcome to work with Ray Jure's group. And on September 26, 1963, Artime told one of his AmWorld CIA case officers that Minoyo is indeed a traitor. Artime also disliked Ray, and memos from the summer of 1963 show CIA officials lying to Artime, telling him Ray is not one of the CIA's chosen leaders, when the CIA had actually been supporting Ray with an average of $25,000 a month since late June 1963. If it had been up to the CIA officials like Richard Helms and E. Howard Hunt, Artime would have been the sole exile leader receiving support, but wasn't what the Kennedys wanted. After much work by Harry, by November 1963, Minoyo and Ray had met to reach a working agreement, and exile informants began to report that Artime had reached an accommodation with each man. Also on board were Tony Varona and the leader of the Cuban exile troops at Fort Benning. The five were not a cohesive group, and their level of commitment to Harry and Bobby varied. This was partially because Harry felt he had to withhold some information about the coup plan from them, such as Almeida's identity, until the exile leader was fully committed to the operation. For example, newly released CIA files cited here for the first time confirm that Harry's account of meeting with Manolo Ray in September 1963. Shortly after that, Almeida's name came up in a meeting between Ray and his CIA case officer, but they both talked so cautiously that it's hard to tell just how much Harry or Bobby had told Ray about Almeida. Minoyo was even more problematic, and as late as mid November, after months of wooing, Harry Williams was still trying to get him fully on board. Tony Verona had been eager to join Harry's plan, perhaps too eager. Unknown to Harry and Bobby, Verona had ties to mob bosses Santo Traficante and Johnny Roselli. When the first round of CIA mafia plots to assassinate Castro in 1959 failed, the CIA began greatly ramping up their efforts in the summer of 1960, 3 months before the presidential election. Richard Nixon had been Eisenhower's point man for Cuba, and Fidel's death was apparently supposed to be the original October surprise that would propel the incumbent vice president to victory. The CIA admits they brought Verona into the plots at that time, along with Santo Traficante, Johnny Roselli, and his boss, Sam Giancana. Carlos Marcello told an FBI informant that he joined the operation at a later date. Despite a series of failures, the CIA continued their work with the mafia. Bobby Kennedy was told about some aspects of the CIA mafia plots in May 1962, after they threatened to interfere with the prosecution of Giancana. However, the CIA admits they told Bobby the plotting had stopped, when in actuality it continued. Without telling Bobby, JFK, or his own CIA director, Richard Helms, continued having Roselli work with Verona on the project through the rest of 1962 and into June 1963 under the supervision of William Harvey, Desmond Fitzgerald's predecessor. The rotund, hard drinking Harvey was sometimes called America's James Bond, though he was replaced by clashing with Bobby Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Evidence indicates that the CIA mafia's plot were still going on in the fall of 1963 and that Miami CIA operations chief David Morales grew close to Roselli in the process. JFK, Bobby, and Harry were determined to exclude the mafia from their coup plans and from any role in post coup Cuba. The mafia would not be allowed to reopen their casinos after Castro was eliminated, but Traficante and Roselli had other ideas. The Kennedys and Harry were never told that in August 1963, the CIA learned that Verona received 200,000 from associates of Roselli. A few weeks later, CIA files show that Verona secretly aligned himself with Traficante associate and former death squad leader Rolando Masfera, whom Harry had banned from the coup plan and who had once been arrested on orders from JFK. A CIA cable says Verona told Masfera that he could become part of the coup plan once certain obstacles were removed. CIA files withheld from Warren Commission and congressional investigators and not published until 2005 confirmed that Manuel Artime was also part of the CIA mafia plots in 1963. Neither Harry nor the Kennedys were aware of Artime's work with the mafia. CIA memos show that Artime planned to use funds provided by the Kennedys to obtain an airplane in Dallas in the summer of 1963 with the assistance of Frank Fiorini, a bagman for Traficante's organization. Also that summer, Artime briefly operated a minor league exile training camp just outside of New Orleans, an operation that reportedly involved two associates of Carlos Marcello, Marcello's plot, David Ferry, and a low-level runner for Marcello's organization named Lee Oswald. Though Minoyo had been involved with Santo Traficante in a 1963 arms deal that went awry, Minoyo was generally considered honest and was not actively involved with the mafia by the fall of 1963. However, he was closely aligned with one of the most violent Cuban exile groups, Alpha 66, which JFK had denounced for mounting unauthorized attacks against Cuban ships earlier in 1963. Alpha 66 was not part of the JFK Almeida coup plan, but it was so closely aligned with Minoyo's SNFE that the FBI considered them practically one group. The leader of Alpha 66, Antonio Veciana, told us that he was receiving aid from a CIA agent named Maurice Bishop, who had introduced him to Lee Harvey Oswald in the summer of 1963 in Dallas. Veciana said he and Oswald discussed killing Castro. Congressional investigator Gayton Funzi investigated the incident extensively and found it credible, identifying Maurice Bishop as a CIA officer, David Atlee Phillips. CIA files confirmed that Phillips was assigned to support Amworld at that time and used a variety of aliases and cover identities, at least one of which he withheld from congressional investigators. Manolo Ray of Jure was considered by the Kennedys and Harry to be a very high integrity and a natural leader. A CIA cable describes Ray as having the highest intellect, sincerity, and conviction, though some CIA officials like E. Howard Hunt didn't like Ray's liberal politics. In addition to the Kennedys' insistence on including Ray in the coup plan, Richard Helms knew that Ray was also in touch with Rolando Cubela and Cuba's top journalist Carlos Franqui, connections that could also prove useful. While Ray had known mafia connections, 2 months before JFK's murder, three associates of Santo Traficante, including Rolando Masfera, were involved in a deliberate effort to link Ray's juror to Oswald and the assassination. In that September 1963 effort, a juror supporter in Dallas named Sylvia Odio received a visit from two exiles, accompanied by a man said to be Lee Harvey Oswald. This incident, detailed in Chapter 13, would take on a huge significance for investigators after JFK's murder. While that effort was a deliberate attempt to stage an encounter that would taint Ray and Jor after JFK's murder, another incident is not so clear cut. A CIA report from October 29, 1963 says that Ray's second in command boasted that Jour had obtained military equipment through robbing unidentified U.S. installation, a military base of some sort. This didn't seem to alarm Ray's CIA case officer because it was one way to equip U.S. backed Cuban exiles with deniable weapons. In the Texas incident involving arms stolen from a U.S. military base, an exile had apparently hinted at the JFK Alameda coup plan, according to FBI and Treasury Department reports from October 1963. The exile told a Dallas gun dealer that in the last week of November 1963, a large scale amphibious operation would take place against the Cuban mainland, and United States military forces or government agencies would possibly be involved as well as rebel Cuban forces. Jack Ruby's auto mechanic was involved in this gun theft ring, and another Ruby associate had similar dealings. FBI reports say that the Dallas gun dealer was probably the source of the bullet found in Oswald's rifle after JFK's assassination. Thus, even Oswald's bullets were linked to pre assassination reports of the JFK Alameda coup plan. It's important to point out the gun dealer was not knowingly part of JFK's assassination, and Ray's juror might not have been the source of the talk about the coup plan. FBI files indicate it was a man linked to Eloy Minoyo. Still, it shows how the shadowy milieu in which the Kennedys' exiles operated gave the mafia opportunities to learn about or compromise each of the chosen exile groups. The Cuban exile officers at Fort Benning were largely beyond reproach, and many would go on to have distinguished careers. However, the base was a stop on Marcelo and Traficante's portion of the French Connection heroin network, which smuggled drugs into the U.S. by hiding them in automobiles and appliances of servicemen returning from Europe. The Fort Benning part of the heroin network would not be exposed until 2 years after JFK's murder, though it was active in 1963. The mob bosses had developed their ties to the area because Fort Benning was just across the river from Phoenix City, Alabama, which until 1954 had a decade long reputation as the most corrupt town in America when it was largely run by Traficante. Before looking more closely at the CIA's role in the JFK Alameda coup plan, we should point out two high officials who were not involved and why. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. Both had been excluded from both the coup planning and the Cuba contingency plans due to the animosity between them and Bobby Kennedy. Bobby had long been frustrated by Hoover's reluctance to go after the mafia and by the FBI director's racism. As for LBJ, Bobby had never gotten over the clashes when LBJ ran against JFK for the 1960 presidential nomination. However, LBJ and Hoover were good friends, and by mid November 1963, both probably knew something big was brewing about Cuba because the reports from FBI agents about the Kennedys' exile leaders and incidents like the one involving the Dallas gun dealer. Also, Hoover would have known about the FBI's involvement in maintaining the secrecy surrounding the November 1963 Chicago and Tampa assassination attempts against JFK. Recently documented information about the state of Hoover's and LBJ relationships with JFK by mid November 1963 is important because some researchers have claimed that Hoover and LBJ were behind JFK's assassination, even though no credible evidence has ever surfaced. Their most suspicious activity occurred during the cover ups following JFK's murder, but extensive evidence now shows that Bobby Kennedy was equally involved and that all three men had the same goal to suppress information that could have triggered a dangerous confrontation with the Soviets. By November 1963, Hoover was secure in his job, even if JFK were reelected, thanks to a deal arranged the previous month. Hoover almost exposed, had first almost exposed, but had then agreed to cover up JFK's liaison with the East German beauty. Anthony Summers first documented the meetings that resulted in Bobby and JFK's agreement to keep Hoover on as the FBI director, even past normal retirement age and into JFK's possible next term if information about the liaison was suppressed. JFK had been introduced to the East German woman by Bobby Baker, Lyndon Johnson's former aide. The press was starting to devote attention to Baker's and Johnson's activities in November 1963. But because what would become known as the Bobby Baker scandal touched JFK and involved members of both parties, it would soon be shut down. Some writers have said that JFK was going to drop LBJ from the ticket in 1964 because of the scandal, thus giving LBJ a theoretical motive to risk killing JFK. But JFK could hardly dump LBJ because of a scandal in which the president was also involved. Also, it would have made little sense for JFK to publicly tie himself to LBJ in numerous public events in Texas in November 1963 if he planned to dump LBJ a few months later. Rumors have long swirled that Hoover and Richard Nixon were in Dallas, meeting with powerful Texas oilmen the night before JFK's assassination, by some accounts. LBJ was also at the meeting, which somehow involved JFK's murder. However, LBJ's busy schedule that evening is well documented, and no credible evidence exists that places the FBI director in Dallas on that date. Although Nixon was in Dallas for a Pepsi convention, press reports verify that he was seen in public with Pepsi board member Joan Crawford at a Dallas nightclub during the time when he was supposedly meeting secretly with Hoover. However, in November 1963, Hoover was keeping a crucial secret from the Kennedys and the Secret Service. The FBI had tracked to Texas and then lost a man using the name of Jean Suetre. Suetre was former French officer who had been part of an attempt the previous year to assassinate French President Charles de Gaulle by spraying his car with gunfire. The story of the CIA's involvement in the JFK Almeida coup plan and in the intelligence failures that led to JFK's death centers on AMWORLD and CIA official Richard Helms. Unlike the agency's director John McCone and CIA's number two man, General Marshall Carter, Helms was a career CIA man. As the deputy director for plans, Helms was essentially the highest ranking operations officer in the CIA. In other words, Helms focused on covert operations instead of on the budgetary, personnel, publicity, and congressional oversight issues the CIA's top two officials had to deal with in addition to their main functions of gathering and evaluating intelligence. Helms had not been involved with the Bay of Pigs, which is one reason he was promoted to deputy director for plans after JFK had forced those who were responsible to leave the CIA. McCone was a wealthy industrialist and former head of the Energy Commission with no intelligence experience. General Carter's background was in the military. The only other official technically above Helms was Lyman Kirkpatrick, formerly the CIA's Inspector General, who had delivered a scathing report about the CIA's performance during the Bay of Pigs. Kirkpatrick had been a rising star in the CIA until he was stricken with polio in the previous decade, which left him confined to a wheelchair. By 1963, Kirkpatrick was in a newly created position called Executive Director, but he had little active role in covert operations. Essentially, that left Helms free to do whatever he wanted with little or no effective oversight. With thousands of agents and operatives around the world, it usually fell to Helms to decide which operational reports addressed to the CIA's director should actually be brought to McCone's attention. Officially, the CIA's role in the JFK Alameda coup plan were limited to getting U.S. intelligence assets into Cuba and assisting the officially sanctioned exile leaders, Harry, Artime, Ray, Minoyo, and Verona. As part of helping Harry Williams, the CIA also carried out several operations approved by Bobby and JFK. As described shortly, these included handling the initial payment of $50,000 to Almeida through a foreign account and maintaining surveillance on Almeida's family after they had left Cuba on a pretext for another country. The CIA's role in assisting Artime was much bigger and included helping him set up supply exile camps in Central America, since any exile operations by Bobby's leaders were supposed to be based outside the U.S. The CIA's support for our time eventually topped 7 million and was handled under the code name M-World. While JFK was president, support for our time's small hit and run raids, as well as the lesser backing for those of Ray, Mignogno, and Verona, was not intended to have serious effect on Castro. For JFK and Bobby, it was intended mainly as a way to deniably support seemingly autonomous exile groups that were really under their control. The exile leaders' role was really to have their own way to get into Cuba for the coup so they could be part of the new provisional government with Almeida. Even within the CIA, AMWORLD was an unusually secret operation, and many of those who knew about it saw it only as a way for the United States to offer our time clandestine support. They didn't know about Almeida and the upcoming coup. For example, Desmond Fitzgerald, the patron blue blood who reported directly to Helms as his chief of Cuban operations, was fully aware of the JFK Almeida coup plan, and Bobby had introduced Fitzgerald to Harry at Bobby's Hickory Hill estate. However, Fitzgerald's assistant apparently didn't know about Almeida and were thus confused about why the U.S. was secretly funneling so much money and support to our time. With so much secrecy surrounding the JFK Alameda coup plan in M-World, officials like Helms and Fitzgerald found ways to keep other secrets even from their own superiors. The secrets Hoover was keeping from the Kennedys pale beside those being kept by Richard Helms. Not only was Helms deceiving JFK and Bobby, he was also withholding crucial information from CIA Director John McCone. In addition to running authorized operations in support of the JFK Alameda coup plan, Helms had inherited two earlier operations that he had decided to continue without telling the Kennedys. One was the CIA mafia plots to assassinate Castro, mentioned earlier. In addition to Verona, these involved Trafficante Roselli and, by his own admission, Carlos Marcello. Others later linked to the fall 1963 plots by news accounts include Dallas mobster Jack Ruby and Chicago hitman Charles Nicoletti. Coordinating with Roselli for the CIA was Miami's David Morales. The other operation Helms inherited involved a European assassin recruiter named Q.J. Wynn. Years later, the CIA would refuse to identify Q.J. Wynn, which is QJWIN, to congressional investigators, and even today release documents and experts don't agree on his identity. His job was basically to spot potential assassins for the CIA and part of the ZRR IFLE, ZR rifle operation. Finally, Helms had reactivated a former CIA asset named Rolando Cubella, code name Amlash within the CIA. As mentioned earlier, Cubella was a Cuban official with no real power, but who offered three main advantages to Hams. First, Cubella could travel freely and extensively throughout the world, making it possible for him to meet with his CIA contacts far from Cuba. Second, he was still on friendly terms with Fidel and several of his associates. Finally, Cubella owned a house at Varadero Beach next to Fidel's. As part of their work on the coup plans, several officials outside the CIA knew about Kubela, but they viewed Kubela simply as someone who was helping to find higher officials to lead the coup and who could provide intelligence if a coup developed. However, Helms and his chief of Cuban operations, Desmond Fitzgerald, had other ideas. According to Kubela, his CIA contacts constantly pressured him to assassinate Fidel. In October 1963, Fitzgerald had even traveled to Paris to meet with Kubela in person. claiming to be the personal emissary of Bobby Kennedy, but Helms later admitted that Bobby and JFK were never told about the trip or about Kubella's role as a possible assassin. By November 22nd, 1963, one of Fitzgerald's men was in Paris meeting with Kubela again, this time offering him a poison pen use to kill Fidel, as well as offering to arrange rifles with telescopic sights to use in assassinating Castro. A CIA report sent to McCone about Kubela's November 22nd meeting with his CIA case officer in Paris makes it clear that Kubela didn't know about the real JFK Almeida coup plan. Kubela didn't mention Almeida as one of the four officials who could be trusted for a move against Amthug, the CIA's code name for Fidel. Almeida wasn't even in the next group, officers who could be counted on to support the coup after Fidel had been removed. Instead, Kubela listed Almeida at the top of the list of the next level of officers, those who would probably fall in line after the coup appears successful. The cable, which would be sent to Macomb by Fitzgerald 2 weeks after JFK's death, doesn't explicitly mention Kubela as the person who would assassinate Fidel, something Helms acknowledged he never admitted to Macomb or Bobby. However, the cable does show the intelligence value of using Kubela as someone to ostensibly seek out officers willing to stage a coup. It provides a list of potentially sympathetic plotters to supplement the allies Almeida had already developed himself. Moreover, the fact that Kubela clearly didn't realize that Almeida was already set to lead the coup and had gotten his family out of Cuba for just that reason shows that Almeida's work for JFK hadn't leaked, at least to the officials on Kubela's level. So it's not hard to see why Helms felt he could get away with pushing Kubela to assassinate Fidel himself, since it was, in some ways, only a half step more than Kubela was officially doing anyway. Desmond Fitzgerald had suggested earlier schemes to kill Castro, which were never authorized by the Kennedys. In fact, the Kennedys were not told about them at all because they involved having JFK's personal emissary, James Donovan, give Fidel a poisoned diving suit during their negotiations about a small prisoner release in the spring of 1963. Fidel and Donovan shared an interest in scuba diving, so Fitzgerald even suggested rigging an exploding seashell to kill Fidel. Helms and Fitzgerald were the highest CIA officials who knew about the unauthorized attempts to kill Fidel. From Helms' perspective, the CIA mafia plots, QJWIN and Kubela as assassin, might have been viewed simply as backup plans in case some problem developed with Almeida. Others might see them as an attempt by Helms to have Fidel eliminated by a CIA originated plan instead of one in which the CIA was only a supporting player. It's also possible that Kubela was being groomed as a patsy to take the fall when Fidel was killed by other means. Also, if at the last minute Almeida proved unwilling or unable to place assassins to kill Fidel at Varadero, it's possible that Helms wanted to make sure people were available to do the job. On November 19, 1963, Helms had shown JFK an arms cache, supposedly from Cuba, that had been found in Venezuela, indicating that Fidel was exporting his revolution to the rest of Latin America. JFK and Bobby seemed impressed, and it may have been Helms' way to ensure that, just in case their secret peace feelers appeared to be meeting with success, they didn't get cold feet about the coup plan. In subcommittee meetings, Helms had been opposed to any attempt at negotiation with Fidel. Of the CIA officers that declassified files linked to the Am World portion of the JFK Almeida coup plan, three were of particular importance in 1963 and the decades that followed: David Atlee Phillips, David Morales, and Henry Heckscher. They continued working together into the 1970s, even using aspects of Am World for coup attempts in Chile. David Atlee Phillips was officially the chief of Cuban operations at the CIA's Mexico City station, but he had a separate role at AmWorld in which he reported directly to Desmond Fitzgerald in Washington. He used different cover identities, among them Lawrence F. Barker and Michael C. Choden, for various operations, and dozens of aliases, including Maurice Bishop, according to the congressional investigator Gaten Funzi. Phillips was a writer and propaganda specialist. According to E. Howard Hunt, Phillips also ran the DRE, a small Cuban exile group that was not part of the coup plan. This raises suspicion about the unusual amount of TV, radio, and newspaper publicity Lee Oswald generated in August 1963 when he had a brief street altercation with the only member of the New Orleans DRE branch. At the time, Oswald was the only member of a phony Fair Play for Cuba chapter in New Orleans, FPCC, though he avoided associating with real leftists or pro Castro people in the city. Shortly after Oswald's radio and TV appearances, Phillips supposedly met with Oswald and Manoyo's exile partner in Dallas. A short time after that, Oswald took his unusual trip to Mexico City, Phillips' main base. There, Oswald was one of the three individuals linked to our Times associates who visited the Cuban embassy within days of each other, sometimes on the same day in an attempt to get into Cuba. Phillips' former boss in Cuba during the time of the revolution was David Morales, a gruff Hispanic Indian from New Mexico. Though Phillips would eventually surpass Morales in CIA rank, in 1963 Morales was still the more senior of the two. Morales was seen within the CIA as someone willing to deal with the mafia and assassinations, and he was close to mafia Don Johnny Roselli in the fall of 1963. At that time, Morales was the chief of operations at the huge Miami CIA station, codenamed JM Wave. It was the largest CIA station in the world, even though it was based in the United States, where the CIA is not supposed to conduct covert operations. The CIA memo from June 1963 that created M-World established a special communications center for it at JM Wave that allowed Morales, Fitzgerald, and Helms to bypass the normal bureaucratic structure and most employees at the Miami station. It's unclear how much the Miami station chief Ted Shackley knew about M-World and Almeida at that time. Morales' position in the M-World part of the JFK Almeida coup plan also gave him a way to use it for his own ends or those of his close friend, John Roselli. Morales has several code names and cover identities we know of so far, like Stanley R. Zamka and Dr. Gonzalez. But if it but if his close associate David Atlee Phillips is any indication, Morales had many more, and even one of those could have allowed him to funnel his time to aid Roselli in a way that wouldn't be obvious to his superiors. Morales frequently traveled from his home base of Miami to Mexico City and to Washington, meaning that no one superior had a full view of his activities. A fellow CIA agent named said that Morales was a roughneck. He was a bully, a hard drinker, and big enough to get away with a lot of stuff other people couldn't get away with. Yet Morales had polish when he needed it. By his own admission in a CIA file, he worked with senior officials in Latin American countries. And 10 years after JFK's murder, Morales would become counterinsurgency advisor for Latin American matters to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. Just prior to that, Morales had been one of four regional directors for the CIA in Vietnam for the Operation Phoenix assassination program, which resulted in the deaths of 20,857 people, according to the testimony of later CIA Director William Colby. Morales was capable of more than being a manager and didn't mind killing people himself, his best friend says. Morales claimed credit for having killed dozens of Tupamaro guerrillas in Uruguay in a door to door search of the apartment building where many of them lived. According to the number two man at Miami CIA station in 1963, if the U.S. government, as a matter of policy, needed someone or something neutralized, Dave would do it, including things that were repugnant to a lot of people. David Morales also reportedly met with Rolando Kubela in September 1963 as one of the CIA men pressuring Kubela to assassinate Fidel. As chief of operations in Miami, Morales would also have been responsible for providing rifles with scopes to Rolando Kubela in Cuba. It's important to point out that Kubela himself was not the one who asked for the meeting in Paris on November 22, 1963. The time was set by someone in the CIA, though it's unclear by whom. Also, Morales' Cuban exile informants in the group codenamed AMOT were responsible for the hazy reports of a Cuban agent near Chicago and in Florida that helped to trigger national security secrecy after the Chicago and Tampa attempts. Henry Rockefeller. Henry Heckscher's role in Emerald is documented by recently released CIA files showing that he was manual time CIA case officer in the summer and fall of 1963. However, Heckscher didn't work with any of our four sources who worked with the Kennedys on the coup plan, so it's not clear how much he knew about Almeida. Heckscher was a higher level CIA official than either Morales or Phillips and had first worked with them in 1954 on the successful CIA coup that overthrew the democratically elected president of Guatemala. Joining Heckscher, Phillips, and Morales in 1954 coup operation was E. Howard Hunt, which makes it logical that Helms would have them working together again in 1963 on another coup. E. Howard Hunt, later infamous as a Watergate figure, was one of the CIA officers working most actively on the Almeida side of the coup plan. In his later years, Hunt was litigious, so we avoided mentioning certain things about him in our earlier book. But we can now reveal that Harry Williams confirmed in taped interviews that Hunt was part of the CIA effort that helped with the most sensitive parts of the JFK Almeida coup plan. A top Kennedy aide indicated that Harry's statement about Hunt were correct. The activities involving Hunt included paying the first installment of 50,000 out of 200,000 to Almeida in a transaction that Bobby Kennedy authorized and the CIA arranged. Hunt was also part of the secret operation in which Almeida's wife and children left Cuba under a pretext prior to November 22, 1963. The plan was for them to wait out the coup in another country while under secret CIA surveillance. This may have been designed to ensure that Almeida didn't double cross the CIA and the Kennedys. Bobby had also authorized Harry and the CIA to assure Almeida that his family would be taken care of financially if anything happened to Almeida and they couldn't return to Cuba. Harry told us that Hunt was one of two CIA officials assigned to assist him. According to former FBI agent William Turner, the other was Hunt's future Watergate partner, James McCord. However, McCord declined to speak with us about this, and Vanity Fair had a similar lack of success when it tried to contact McCord about the matter in 1994. According to Harry, Hunt seemed to resent having to help him, since Hunt was used to giving orders to Cuban exiles instead of taking them. Prior to working on the JFK Almeida coup plan, Hunt's career in the CIA had been erratic, but his friendship with Richard Helms had allowed him some measure of success. Before getting to know Helms, Hunt had worked with David Atlee Lee, Phillips, David Morales, and Henry Heckscher on the CIA's successful 1954 coup in Guatemala. According to Helms' biographer Thomas Powers, Hunt first met Helms in 1956. Powers says that Hunt conceived of Helms as a friend, admired him openly, and more than once called on him for help. David Atlee Phillips wrote that Hunt idolized Helms, perhaps because Helms helped him after Hunt's botched stint as the CIA chief of Uruguay. It's often overlooked that while Hunt was in Uruguay in early 1960, he was secretly organizing a plot to overthrow the Uruguayan government, according to noted journalist Tad Schulk. According to Schulk, it's not clear who ordered Hunt to start organizing a coup, since neither the White House nor the State Department ever entertained such ideas about Uruguay. In any event, Hunt was transferred from Uruguay to work on the CIA's attempt to overthrow another government, that of Fidel Castro, in the operation that eventually grew into the Bay of Pigs. E. Howard Hunt played an important role in the Bay of Pigs operation until he dropped out at the last minute in April 1961 to protest, including the liberal Manolo Rey in the post Fidel government. If it had been up to Hunt after Fidel's elimination, Cuba would have been ruled by his good friend, the ultra conservative Manuel Artime. But the Kennedys insisted on Ray's inclusion, so Hunt left the operation. Shortly after he did, the CIA mafia plots failed, as did the rest of the Bay of Pigs. More than a year earlier, Hunt had written a memo suggesting the assassination of Fidel in conjunction with a small invasion. So it's intriguing to speculate that Hunt may have had some role in or acknowledge of the CIA mafia plots. Buttressing that is that the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo was assassinated with CIA assistance just a month after the Bay of Pigs. Trujillo's security chief claimed that Hunt and Johnny Roselli had been involved. In 1961, Richard Helms helped Hunt find new opportunities in the CIA. Hunt had been given permission to write spy novels under a pseudonym, and Thomas Powers notes that Helms liked Hunt's books. He kept copies of them in his office, which he sometimes gave to visitors. Apparently, Helms' personal relationship with Hunt was enough for him to assign Hunt to work with Harry on the JFK Alameda coup plan, despite Hunt's antipathy for some of his leaders like Ray. From Helm's perspective, Hunt's experience in planning coups in Guatemala, Uruguay, Cuba, and possibly the Dominican Republic must have made Hunt seem like a logical choice. Still, Hunt's friendship with Artime and dislike of Ray were well known within the CIA, so Hunt couldn't have an official role with either of those exiles. Harry told us about one occasion when Hunt sent one of his associates, a CIA officer, to see him. Harry thinks Hunt sent the associate because of the friction that existed between Hunt and Harry. Even though the CIA officer was driving an old car, as Harry said they often did to avoid attracting attention, the agency man started telling Harry, "There is a lot of money to be made." Harry looked at him and said, "How?" The CIA officer said, "There is a lot of money in the budget for this thing, and some people have." Harry didn't realize it at the time, but the total budget for just the Emerald part of the JFK Alameda coup plan would total at least $7 million, and then some agents estimated it was much higher. But Harry felt the CIA man was trying to buy me. So Harry told him, "Look, when I want to make money, I will go back to my profession as a mining engineer. I am not here to make money. I am not interested." It's important to know that the CIA officer may have simply been testing Harry to see if he could be bought. The same Hunt associate later took Harry to a Miami restaurant where Traficante himself tried to bribe Harry. By his own admission, Hunt's assistant in the early 1960s was Bernard Barker, who was also later involved in Watergate. Barker's official CIA position was as a Miami based agent who frequently passed along information from Frank Fiorini, a Traficante bagman. Fiorini had changed his name to Frank Sturgis by the time he was apprehended at the Watergate with Barker, McCord, and others. While Barker has never acknowledged being officially privy to the JFK Alameda coup plan, one of his CIA reports from November 14, 1963 mentions rumors of an operation including Juan Almeida to overthrow Fidel. In a television interview, Barker told Bill Moyers, "I would have followed Howard Hunt to hell and back." And in another TV program, Barker said that at the time of the Kennedy assassination, President Kennedy's government had reached its peak in its efforts to overthrow Castro. However, as this edition's special addendum documents for the first time, by 1963 Barker was working for Santo Traficante. The Kennedys didn't know that, so Hunt and Barker worked closely with Harry Williams on sensitive parts of the coup plan. Thus, whatever Barker knew, his real boss, Traficante, could know as well, giving the Godfather a direct pipeline into America's most secret operation. To be continued.